gray rain chills, stucco walls. Every drop that hits the stone makes the surface slick, reflecting the dim light of a London afternoon like a series of polished headstones. Down the narrow streets, the water pools in the cracks of the pavement, swallowing the echoes of footsteps before they can reach the end of the block. The architecture here stands tall. Rows of townhouses pressed together like mourners at a funeral, their windows gray, dark, and vacant. There is a weight to the air, a dampness that clings to the brickwork and refuses to evaporate. It is a landscape defined by what lies beneath the surface, a place where the history of the buildings is etched into the very mortar. The wind picks up, driving the rain against the facades, and the structures seem to shiver under the onslaught. Nothing moves on the street level. The silence is absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of water against metal gutters and the distant muffled roar of the city. This is not a neighborhood that welcomes the living. It is a repository for the past. The year was 1946. A train pulled into the station, hissing steam into the damp London air, and Peter Rachman stepped onto the platform. He carried nothing but the weight of the years behind him. He walked through the terminal, his boots striking the concrete with a rhythmic, measured cadence that ignored the surrounding chaos of a city still picking through its own rubble. He did not look at the faces of the other travelers. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon of the street ahead, scanning the architecture of the city not for beauty, but for utility. He moved with a stillness that felt out of place among the frantic energy of the post-war crowds. He found a room, a small space with peeling wallpaper, and a single window that overlooked a narrow alley, and he sat in the dark for hours. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He watched the shadows shift across the floorboards, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood as if measuring the dimensions of his new territory. This was not the relief of a man who had found safety. It was the calculated assessment of a predator. It was about owning the air that others breathed. He began with a single terrace house, a crumbling brick shell that smelled of damp and neglect. He did not renovate. He did not repair. He walked through the rooms with a notebook, measuring the square footage of every corner, every alcove, every closet. He saw the potential for division where others saw only a home. He signed the deed with a steady hand, the ink drying on the paper like a stain. The hunger that had once been a desperate, clawing need for bread now manifested as a desire for volume. He mapped the neighborhood, marking the buildings with red ink, identifying the properties where the tenants were elderly, or alone, or too afraid to complain. He spent his nights in the back of a dim pub, listening to the murmurs of the street, learning the weaknesses of the people who lived behind the doors he now owned. He stopped looking at people as neighbors and started seeing them as units of income. He practiced the art of the eviction notice, refining the language until it was sharp enough to cut through any resistance. The city around him was still rebuilding, but he was already dismantling it from the inside. He was the architect of a new kind of ruin, a predator who found that the most profitable way to live in a broken city was to ensure it stayed that way. The 1957 Rent Act arrived on his desk like a gift. He read the pages not with the eyes of a citizen, but with the focus of a locksmith studying a complex mechanism. He found the loophole buried in the fine print, a clause designed to protect the market that instead left the individual exposed. He traced the words with a nicotine-stained fingernail, his breath hitching only once as the implications took hold. This was not just policy, it was a scalpel. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the rows of 1950s Victorian terraces. He saw them differently now. They were no longer just brick and mortar. They were assets waiting to be dissected. He pulled a tenant's file from his drawer, a thin folder containing a lease agreement. He laid the act beside it, comparing the legal jargon to the reality of the living room he intended to reclaim. He made a single mark on the document, a sharp, decisive slash of red ink. The law had provided the edge, and he was ready to start cutting. He did not feel the weight of the lives he was about to displace. He only felt the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a man who had finally found the tool to dismantle the world around him, one eviction notice at a time. He moved through the 1950s, damp, dark, and gray Notting Hill, with a banker's ledger and a predator's patience. He began buying the crumbling Victorian terraces in rapid succession, one after another, until he held the deeds to entire blocks. He did not care for the architecture or the history etched into the brickwork. He cared only for the names listed on the rental agreements. He walked the streets at dusk, stopping before the tall gray 1950s narrow houses to watch the lights flicker on behind the curtains. He saw the elderly black woman in the ground floor flat, the young black family on the second, and the retired black clerk in the attic. They were sitting tenants, protected by laws that he had already learned to bypass. They were unaware that the man standing on the pavement, staring up at their windows, was the new architect of their misfortune. He made no effort to introduce himself. He did not knock on doors to offer greetings. He simply checked his list, verified the address, and moved to the next property. He was building a kingdom of paper and stone, a collection of lives that he now owned as surely as he owned the floorboards beneath their feet. He stood in the damp London air, counting the windows, calculating the turnover, and waiting for the right moment to turn the key. The nightmare was not yet visible, but the foundation was laid. The transition from owner to oppressor was not a sudden act, but a series of calculated adjustments. Rachman sat at his desk, the ledger open, and began to map the lives of his tenants like a general surveying a battlefield. He did not see families, elderly couples, or working men. He saw obstacles to be cleared, friction to be removed, and space to be reclaimed. He drew lines through names, each strike of the pen representing a household he intended to dismantle. He began the systematic erasure of their security, starting with the small, persistent irritations that erode a person's will to stay. He sent letters that were polite in tone but predatory in intent, demanding repairs that were impossible to fulfill or citing clauses that did not exist. When a tenant called to plead for more time, he listened, held the receiver away from his ear, and waited for the silence that followed his refusal. He leaned back, lit a cigar, and watched the smoke drift toward the ceiling. The process was efficient, the resistance was minimal. The psychological pressure was no longer sufficient. Rachman needed a more visceral catalyst to force the remaining tenants out. He waited for the first deep freeze of winter, when the London damp turned into a biting, relentless chill. He sent his men into the basements and the alleyways, armed with heavy shears and a singular instruction: sever the lines. They moved through the shadows of the Victorian terraces, cutting the power cables that fed the heat and light to the rooms above. In the ground floor flat, the elderly woman reached for her lamp, but the switch clicked into dead silence. Upstairs, the young family watched their heater flicker once and vanish, leaving only the sound of the wind rattling the frames. The warmth bled out of the houses within minutes. The walls turned cold to the touch, and the air inside became as frigid as the street outside. Rachman stood on the opposite pavement, watching the blocks of houses go dark, one by one. He saw the silhouettes of people moving in the dim gray light of the street lamps, searching for candles that would not hold back the frost. The cold was a slow poison, but some Afro-Caribbean tenants remained, huddled under blankets in the dark. Rachman realized the silence of the frost was not enough to break them. He needed a sound that would shatter their resolve. He sent his men out again, not with shears this time, but with heavy stones and iron bars. They moved through the narrow alleyways, their footsteps muffled by the damp London fog. In the second-floor flat, an elderly man sat by his fireplace, listening to the wind howl through the cracks. Then came the sound of glass splintering. A stone tore through the window, showering the room in shards and letting the freezing night air rush in like a physical blow. The rhythm was deliberate, a series of sharp, violent interruptions that turned the safety of home into a place of exposure. Rachman watched from the shadows of a doorway, his face unreadable as the street filled with the sound of breaking glass. The shattered glass did not empty the rooms. Some tenants, hardened by necessity, simply boarded up the holes and stayed. Rachman watched the stubborn lights flicker behind plywood patches, his patience thinning. He sat in his office, the ledger open before him, tracing the names of those who refused to vacate. He did not need more stones, he needed presence. He reached for the telephone, his voice steady, issuing the call. Within the hour, a black Humber pulled to the curb, idling in the thick fog. 4 men stepped out, heavy-set and deliberate. They did not look at the windows or the boarded doors. They looked at the locks. Rachman watched from his window, a ghost in his own empire. They were the physical manifestation of his will, sent to dismantle the final remnants of resistance. As they reached the front door, the heavy iron knocker struck the wood, a single booming sound. The time for extraction had begun. The heavy door groaned open, but the men did not enter alone. From the back of the sedan, they pulled 2 German shepherds, their muscles coiled and taut. The animals were not pets. They were instruments of noise and shadow. The men led them into the narrow, cramped hallway of the Victorian terrace, the floorboards vibrating under the weight of the dog's paws. As the animals caught the scent of the residents huddled in the upper flats, they began to bark. The sound was not a warning. It was a rhythmic, guttural assault that bounced off the peeling wallpaper and low ceilings. It filled every corner of the structure, turning the air thick with a threat of teeth and lunging weight. In the small, dim corridor, the barking became a physical presence, vibrating through the walls. and into the bones of those hiding behind their bedroom doors. The dogs strained against their leashes, their claws clicking sharply against the floor, creating a cacophony that drowned out all other sound. The residents, trapped in their small partitioned rooms, could do nothing but listen to the snarling echoes that seemed to come from every direction at once. The hallway, once a place of transit, had become a cage. The dogs paced, their shadows stretching long and distorted. The barking finally ceased, leaving a silence more terrifying than the noise. The men did not wait for the tenants to emerge. They drew heavy iron crowbars from their coats and set to work on the hinges of the front doors. The wood groaned under the pressure, a sharp, splintering crack echoing through the street as the first door gave way. It was not unlatched, it was torn from the frame, leaving a jagged, gaping hole where security used to be. The second and third doors followed in rapid succession, the sound of metal grinding against stone filling the damp air. With the barriers gone, the London fog did not hesitate. It curled into the hallways like a living thing, thick, gray, and freezing. The tenants stood in their rooms, watching the mist coil around their ankles, their breath blooming in the sudden, sharp drop in temperature. The houses were no longer homes, they were merely shells, open to the elements and the relentless, biting chill of the winter night. The physical destruction was only the beginning. Rachman realized that breaking a door was temporary, but breaking a person was permanent. He retreated to his office, leaving the heavy mob to their work, and began a new, more clinical phase of his campaign. He kept a ledger, a meticulous record of every tenant's habits, their nightly routines, and the specific fears that kept them awake. He watched from the shadows of his doorway as an elderly woman flinched at the sound of a heavy footfall in the hall. He noted the way a young father gripped his chair when the lights flickered. These were not just people, they were puzzles of anxiety waiting to be solved. He studied their reactions like a scientist observing a specimen under a lens. If a tenant feared the dark, he ensured the hallway bulbs were smashed every evening. He learned that silence was often more effective than noise. He would stand outside a door for hours, never knocking, never speaking, just breathing. He was no longer just a landlord, he was an architect of dread, mapping the internal terrain of their minds to find the exact point where their resolve would snap. Rachman realized that the most effective way to break a community was not to destroy it from the outside, but to poison it from within. He began to look at the city with a new, predatory lens, identifying the deep-seated anxieties of his white tenants. He saw their prejudices not as obstacles, but as tools. He started visiting the docks and the crowded boarding houses, actively recruiting West Indian families who were desperate for a place to call home. He offered them rooms in the very buildings where he had spent months terrorizing the existing residents. He did not tell the new arrivals about the history of the property, nor did he warn the current tenants of the change. He simply arrived with a new family, their belongings packed into crates, and installed them in the vacant rooms. The effect was immediate. He watched from the corner of the street as the white tenants retreated behind their doors, their faces tight with suspicion and fear. He saw the new arrivals struggle to settle in, met with cold stares and slammed doors. The tension in the hallways became a physical presence, thick and suffocating. Rachman stood in the shadows, lighting a cigar, watching the two groups collide. He had successfully turned the neighborhood against itself, creating a volatile environment. The panic did not happen all at once. It began with the quiet departure of a single family, their belongings loaded into a van under the cover of darkness. Then, the trend accelerated. Driven by the manufactured friction and the constant low-level dread, the long-term residents began to break. They left behind half-empty cupboards, abandoned furniture, and the lingering scent of lives interrupted. Rachman watched the exodus from his window, counting the vacant properties like assets on a ledger. He saw the street transform into a collection of hollow shells. Where there had once been neighbors, there was now only silence and dust. The community he had spent years dismantling was finally gone, leaving a vacuum of power in its wake. He walked through the vacant rooms, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. He felt no remorse for the lives he had uprooted, only a cold satisfaction at the space he had cleared. The neighborhood was now a blank canvas, stripped of its history and its people. Rachman moved quickly to fill the silence. He did not seek single tenants anymore, he sought density. He brought in carpenters to slice large rooms into tiny, suffocating boxes. He hammered plywood partitions into place, ignoring the lack of ventilation and the absence of fire escapes. He returned to the docks and the transient boarding houses, this time with a promise of immediate housing for those who had nowhere else to go. He brought them in by the dozen. He crammed entire families into single subdivided rooms, stacking lives on top of each other like crates in a warehouse. The hallways, once quiet, became arteries of constant, frantic movement. He watched as the new tenants struggled to navigate the narrow, dark corridors, their belongings spilling out into the cramped common areas. The air inside the houses turned thick with the smell of damp, cooking oil, and unwashed laundry. He saw the danger in the overloaded electrical sockets and the blocked exits, but he only saw the rent receipts multiplying. Each room became a pressure cooker, a small, volatile space where the desperation of the occupants was held in check, only by the fear of being back on the street. He walked through the properties, listening to the muffled sounds of children crying and adults arguing through the thin, makeshift walls. Rachman did not ask for rent. He demanded a toll for survival. He set the rates at levels that defied logic, knowing full well the families had no other options. Every week he walked the hallways, his presence marked by the rhythmic thud of his boots. He stood outside each door, waiting for the envelope of cash to be slid out from the shadows. When a tenant could not pay the full amount, he did not offer a grace period. He simply refused the partial payment, letting the debt compound with interest that grew like a cancer. He watched as the families skipped meals and sold their few remaining possessions just to keep a roof over their heads. The fear was palpable, a heavy weight that settled in the corners of every room. He saw the desperation in their eyes when they asked for more time, and he used that desperation as a tool to tighten his grip. He made it clear that the street was the only alternative to his squalor. The tenants became trapped in a cycle of borrowing and paying, a treadmill that led nowhere. Every coin he collected was a testament to their entrapment. The office was a sanctuary of stillness, a stark contrast to the frantic, cramped hallways of his properties. Rachman sat behind a heavy oak desk, the wood scarred by years of use. He reached for a cigar, struck a match, and watched the flame dance before touching it to the tobacco. He drew a long, slow breath, exhaling until the air in the room turned gray and stagnant. The smoke curled toward the ceiling, swirling like a shroud over the ledgers spread out before him. He did not look out the window at the streets he had hollowed out. He focused entirely on the stacks of coins and crumpled notes piled on the desk. His fingers moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, sorting the currency into neat, rigid columns. Each stack represented a week of someone else's survival, a fraction of a life traded for a few square feet of floor space. He counted the coins, the metallic clinking sound sharp and clear in the quiet room. He did not feel the weight of the misery he had manufactured. He only felt the satisfying density of the metal under his thumb. He paused, watching the smoke drift through the dim light, and then returned to the counting. The ledger grew, the numbers climbing, while the world outside the office door remained trapped in the cycle he had perfected. He was the architect of their ruin, and he was finally tallying the cost of his success. The ledger on the desk was no longer enough to manage the growing chaos. Rachman needed an enforcer who understood the language of fear. Better than his current thugs, he found that man in Michael de Freitas. They met in the back room of a dim pub, away from the prying eyes of the street. De Freitas did not speak of politics or justice. He spoke of leverage. He understood that the most effective way to collect a debt was to make the cost of resistance higher than the cost of submission. Rachman listened, his eyes fixed on the man across the table. There was no warmth in the exchange, only the cold recognition of a shared predator. They did not need to discuss ideology or race. They spoke only of numbers, of pressure points, and of the absolute necessity of total control. When de Freitas stood up to leave, the deal was struck. It was a union of convenience that defied all social boundaries, proving that exploitation had no political home. With de Freitas as his debt collector, Rachman expanded his reach into the darkest corners of the city. The alliance was a machine, and it began to grind through the remaining resistance. The ledger was open to the final page of the month when the pain arrived. It did not announce itself with a warning. It struck like a physical blow to the center of his chest. Rachman gasped, his hand gripping the edge of the heavy oak desk, until his knuckles turned white. The cigar dropped from his fingers, landing on the carpet and smoldering in the sudden stillness. He tried to draw breath, but his lungs refused to expand. He reached out, fingers clawing at the air, and caught the edge of the desk, dragging the entire structure toward him as he fell. The sound of the desk hitting the floor was a thunderclap in the quiet room. Ledgers, pens, and stacks of currency scattered across the floor, paper fluttering like dying birds. He lay on the cold wood, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as the world narrowed to a single, agonizing point of pressure. The empire he had built on the misery of others was now irrelevant. His heart, the engine of his greed, stuttered and then stopped. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The silence in the office did not last. Within hours, the police arrived to catalog the wreckage of the empire. They expected to find ledgers of rent and eviction notices, but they found something far more volatile. Tucked away in a locked cabinet were files that linked Rachman to the highest echelons of London society. Among the names were Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davies. These women, who had been part of Rachman's inner circle, suddenly became the bridge between the slums of Notting Hill and the corridors of Westminster. The investigators realized that the rot was not contained to the crumbling terraces. It had seeped into the government itself. As the files were opened, the names of ministers and officials began to surface, tangled in the same web of exploitation. The private life of a slum landlord was about to become the public downfall of a government. The transition from private scandal to national crisis occurred in a single news cycle. Journalists, sniffing the scent of corruption, began to piece together the narrative that linked the dead landlord to the highest levels of the state. The files recovered from the office were no longer mere evidence. They were ammunition. As the names of ministers appeared alongside those of Keeler and Rice Davies, the public narrative shifted violently. The Profumo affair was born not in a vacuum, but in the wreckage of the slum empire. Headlines screamed of betrayal, sex, and the illicit intersection of power and poverty. The government, desperate to distance itself from the association, found the links impossible to sever. Every document uncovered in the Notting Hill office acted as a new charge in a chain reaction. The scandal breached the walls of Westminster, turning the private habits of the elite into a matter of national security. Rachman, even in death, dictated the terms of the collapse. The fire was no longer contained to the slums. It was burning through the very foundation of the establishment. The scandal broke the dam of public indifference. Journalists and photographers descended upon Notting Hill, not to cover the political fallout, but to document the source of the rot. They pushed past the boarded-up entrances and into the narrow, damp hallways that had been the site of so much misery. The world watched as the reality of the slums was laid bare. They photographed the broken floorboards, the leaking ceilings, and the rooms where multiple families were crammed into spaces meant for one. The images were undeniable. The public, previously shielded by distance and social class, now faced the raw physical evidence of the exploitation. Outrage surged through the streets. People gathered in squares, demanding accountability for the conditions that had been allowed to fester for years. The narrative of the mistresses and the ministers faded, replaced by a visceral demand for justice for the tenants who had been discarded. The focus shifted from the elite to the forgotten victims of the rent trap. Every shutter click was a hammer blow to the system that had enabled such cruelty. The facade of the Victorian terraces had been stripped away, revealing the human cost of greed. The city could no longer look away. The demand for justice was absolute. The pressure from the streets reached the floor of Parliament within weeks. Ministers who had once ignored the plight of the tenants now scrambled to distance themselves from the legislative gaps that had enabled such unchecked greed. The government, paralyzed by the scandal, realized that the only way to survive was to dismantle the very mechanisms that had built the slum empire. Debates raged in the chamber, but the outcome was inevitable. The 1965 Rent Act was drafted not as a reform, but as a weapon to strike back at the legacy of the landlord. It targeted the loopholes directly. It outlawed the harassment of sitting tenants and stripped landlords of the power to evict without due process. The days of cutting power lines and removing doors to force families out were legally extinguished. The act established rent tribunals, giving tenants a shield against the arbitrary, exorbitant price hikes that had fueled the misery of Notting Hill. For the first time, the law stood between the landlord and the living room. The legal tools that had turned Victorian terraces into death traps were rendered obsolete overnight. It was a cold, bureaucratic victory, but it was absolute. The state had finally acknowledged that the market could not be left to police its own cruelty. As the ink dried on the legislation, the era of the slum landlord was officially closed. The legal architecture of the empire had been demolished. The legal victory was only the beginning. The physical empire had to be dismantled brick by brick. Bailiffs and inspectors moved into the terraces, not as collectors, but as agents of reclamation. They tore down the makeshift partitions that had turned family homes into cramped, fire-trapped cubicles. They pried the iron bars from the windows and hauled away the debris that had accumulated in the hallways. The men who had once patrolled these corridors with dogs were gone, their authority evaporated by the stroke of a pen. In their place, crews worked to restore the basic utilities, reconnecting the power lines and fixing the plumbing. Every hammer strike against the rotting wood felt like a final rejection of the previous regime. The empire was effectively dead, but the scars on the Victorian stucco remained as visible as ever. Decades passed, and the silence of the law was replaced by the noise of construction. The Victorian terraces, once the stage for systematic exploitation, became the most sought-after real estate in the city. Developers moved in with blueprints that prioritized profit over the memory of the past. They scraped away the soot and the grime, replacing the weathered brick with polished stone and glass. The narrow hallways that once held the fear of the heavy mob were widened and opened into airy, light-filled spaces. Multi-million-pound townhouses rose from the wreckage, their facades gleaming with a sterile, expensive perfection. Every trace of the subdivided rooms and the fire traps was meticulously scrubbed clean. The new owners arrived with their wealth, unaware of the history that had been buried beneath their floorboards. The streets that were once synonymous with misery were rebranded as the pinnacle of urban elegance. The past was not just forgotten, it was physically overwritten by the architecture of gentrification. The tombstone-like stucco was painted over in pristine white. The streets were scrubbed clean, but the language refused to follow suit. While the townhouses gleamed with new paint, and the history of the slum was buried under layers of modern renovation, a different kind of monument took root. It did not exist in brick or mortar, but on the printed page. Lexicographers, documenting the rot of the 20th century, codified the cruelty that had once defined these blocks. They took the name of the man who had turned misery into a business model and forged it into a noun, Rachmanism. It entered the dictionary not as a tribute, but as a warning. It became a permanent linguistic scar, a term that ensured the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable could never be fully erased from the collective memory. While the developers could tear down walls and replace broken windows, they could not delete the definition from the lexicon. Every time the word appeared in a textbook or a legal brief, it acted as a reminder of the shadows that once stretched across the pavement. The dictionary became the final, unyielding witness to the era. It preserved the truth. The man who built this empire did not start in the shadows of London. He began in the literal ashes of the 20th century, surviving the camps where millions were erased. He walked out of that nightmare with nothing, a survivor who had seen the absolute limit of human cruelty. But when he arrived in the city, the instinct to survive did not fade. It sharpened, it curdled. He took the trauma of his own displacement and weaponized it against those who had done him no harm. He looked at the crumbling terraces of Notting Hill and saw not homes, but fuel. He had been given a second chance at life, a rare opportunity to rise from the wreckage of history and build something new. Instead, he chose to replicate the very mechanisms of destruction. He had narrowly escaped. He became the architect of his own small localized apocalypse. He did not just exploit the vulnerable, he dismantled their lives with cold precision. Of a man who had learned that the world was a zero-sum game. The tragedy was not just in the eviction notices or the broken windows, it was in the fundamental choice he made. He could have used his survival to foster life, but he chose to burn everything else down to keep his own flame flickering. He proved that the cycle of violence does not end with the survivor. The rain continues to fall on Notting Hill. It is a persistent, gray drizzle that coats the Victorian stucco in a thin, slick layer of moisture. It does not wash away the history of the streets. It only makes the stone glisten like a tombstone. The water runs down the gutters, pooling in the cracks of the pavement where the heavy mob once walked. It drips from the ornate ironwork of the multi-million-pound townhouses, cold and indifferent to the luxury that now occupies the space. This is the same rain that fell when the power lines were cut in the dead of winter. It is the same rain that soaked the belongings of the families forced into the street. The city tries to scrub the past clean with gentrification, replacing the rot with glass and polished steel, but the weather remains a constant witness. The water seeps into the foundations, a reminder that the ground beneath these structures is soaked in the memory of the exploitation that built them. No amount of renovation can alter the fundamental nature of the earth. The rain keeps falling, relentless and steady, refusing to let the past dissolve into the fog. Rain remembers shadows through changing streets.